Okay, we want to talk briefly about the empirical rule. Then we'll talk a little bit about z-scores. Okay, so the empirical rule tells us what percent of the data lie within 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations. So let's say we have a some data that's normally distributed with a mean. Let's say it's the distance how far students drive to school, and our mean is 25 miles and our standard deviation is 5 miles. Okay? And our random variable is how far students drive to campus. Okay? Okay, so if it's normally distributed, our mean is at the center, right? 25. And remember, with the normal distribution, the inflection points are 1 standard deviation. So if I add 1 standard deviation, 25 plus 5, I get 30. 2 standard deviations is 35. And 3 standard deviations is 40. 1 standard deviation below the mean is 20. 2 standard deviations below the mean is 15. And 3 standard deviations is 10, right? So if you think about it, when I count standard deviations, the mean is really 0 standard deviations away from the mean because it is the mean, right? So 30, as we said, is 1 standard deviation above the mean. 35 is 2 standard deviations above the mean. And 40 is 3 standard deviations above the mean. 20 is 1 standard deviation below the mean, so we say -1 since it's to the left. 15 is -2 standard deviations below the mean. And 10 is -3 standard deviations. So I just wanted to show you this. Typically, this is like our X scale or the variable scale. And this is called the z-scale because we're going to calculate what are called z-scores, which I'll show you here in just a second. But I just wanted to show you what those mean in terms of the empirical rule. When we talk about the empirical rule, we're saying that what the empirical rule says is about 68% of your data lie within 1 standard deviation of the mean. So that's saying about 68% of students, 1 standard deviation below is 20 and 1 standard deviation above is 30. So that's saying 68% of your data lie within 1 standard deviation of the mean. So about 68% of students drive between 20 and 30 miles. Does that make sense? Okay, the empirical rule also says about 95% fall between 2 standard deviations of the mean. So this would be saying in our data about 95% of students drive between, what was 2? 15 miles and 35 miles. Okay, and then 3 standard deviations, the empirical rule tells us 99.7% of the data fall. Okay, now you can break this up into chunks a little bit because it's symmetrical. So if 68% lie between 1 standard deviation and symmetrical, this divides it in half. That means 34% is right here and 34% is right here. Does that make sense to you? All right, so we can do a little math here and figure out, okay, well, the other thing we know is, think about this way, 50% of your data lie on this side, right? Because it divides it in half. So if I wanted to know, what percent of students drive less than 30 miles, well, if I know this is 50% and this little chunk right here is 34, I would do 50 plus 34, get 84%. So some of the homework problems will ask you that. You need to find these little chunks in between. Okay, so let me go with the new picture here for you. Okay, again, the empirical rule says 68% are within 1 standard deviation, right? So therefore we know that this is 34% and this little block here is 34%. If we know that 95% lie within 2 standard deviations, then we can also figure out these little sections here. Okay, we can say 95% minus 68%, and then divide that in half, right? So I can say 95 minus 68, divide that in half. That tells me this little section is 13.5%, and this little section here is 13.5%. Okay? And you can do the same thing for this last one, 99.7. So we can say 99.7 minus 95. 99.7 minus 95. Divide it in half. So 2.35% are in these little things. And then the tails here, right, is 100 minus 99.7 or 0.3. You got 0.15% here, 0.15% here. Okay, so if I plug in our, what was my 25, right? 25, 30, 35, 40, right? 20, 15, and 10. You can do lots of things with these percents. So the empirical rule is the 68, 95, 99.7. Okay, so 68% lie within 1, 95 lie within 2, okay, and 99.7 lie within 3. Okay, but you can divide it up into these little chunks like we just did. So if you wanted to know, okay, what percent fall between dry between 30 and 40 miles, I would just add 13.5 and 2.35. 13.5 plus 2.35, right? So that means 15.85% of students drive between 30 and 40 miles. Make sense?